welcome you to the panel discussion, Food for All. What takes it to secure global supplies with nutrition and basic needs? Thank you for joining us. And a special welcome goes to our speakers, Professor Jomo Sundaram. Thank you for making this long way to Vienna. But as well as to face Lumonya. She's already joined us via Zoom, and also Sofía, Monsalve, Suárez. You will see them later on, but a warm welcome also to them. All speakers will be properly introduced later on by our moderator, Werner, Raza. Warm greetings also to those who will be with us via Zoom or Facebook. My name is Franz Schmidjell, and I'm in charge at the VIDC for the Africa Policy Desk. This panel discussion was organized jointly by the VIDC and the ÖFSE. My thanks go to the ÖFSE team for the good cooperation, to the Austrian Development Agency for their financial support, and last but not least, to my colleagues from the VIDC for their organizational assistance. One technical remark, you will find some feedback questionnaires on the feed. Please make use of them, that we can learn from you how to do better in future. Now, why? We think this is an important event. In the recent months, the prices for staple food rose rapidly. The price of wheat, for example, increased by 130% within 1 year, especially in the global south, where especially the poorer people have to spend 50 to 70% of their income on food. This had disastrous effects. In total, 1 billion people suffer from hunger, one of the highest numbers in human history. Hunger reports about hunger riots have disappeared from the headlines. Hunger, however, remained. This introduction was used in 2010 on an event we organized on the same topic. And there was no Ukraine war at this time. There was a similar situation in 2011, 12, and 2014. I mean, there was one difference some of you recognize. Maybe it's not 1 billion people, it's 830 million people who suffer from hunger. Although how to count it is always a difficult thing, but this number is much too high. And not only too high, this number is a political scandal, because we live in a world where there is enough food for all. Therefore, we think it's important to look again into the structural causes of food insecurity, of malnutrition or undernutrition and hunger, and also what would be possible alternative policies. Just to repeat, in 2010, our experts stressed as causes responsible for these price volatilities, among others, the unregulated financial market and food speculation, the changed consumption patterns, especially the increase of meat consumption, the demand for meat, and the use, or we can also, I would say, the misuse of corn, wheat, soybeans, and sugarcane for biofuels, especially in the US, but also in the European Union. The speakers this time criticized also the agricultural policies in the global south, which favored big cooperation, export and cash crop production, and land grabbing at the expense of small-scale farming. And above all that, at this time the speakers referred to the disastrous impact of climate crisis. So I'm very curious today what has changed and what is still the same, what hasn't changed. But now it's time to introduce our moderator, Werner Raza. He's head of the ÖFSE, the Austrian Foundation for Development Research. He's an economist with a focus on international trade and development. and he has been and is member of various national and international advisory committees in the fields of foreign trade, finance, and development policy. I wish you an interesting and hopefully inspiring debate, and want to hand over to you, Werner. Thank you.
Good afternoon to everybody. Thanks a lot for the very interesting and nice introduction, Franz. Thanks a lot to VIDC for the very good cooperation we had on this conference. So I'm very pleased that we, on a rather short-term basis, could organize today's conference on the topic of food for all. And I'm also very pleased that we have three distinguished speakers who will kind of discuss with us their analysis about the shortcomings, the problems of the global food system, and also, and that is obviously very important, we'll discuss without their ideas about what needs to change, what kind of alternatives do we need to introduce and promote in terms of creating a better global food system. So just to give you a short introduction on the structure of today's program. So we start with a presentation, a keynote by Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram, which will then be followed by two comments from Sofía Monsalve Suárez and Lumonya. I will introduce the two commentators a little bit later. And afterwards, we'll have a short panel discussion, so to give each speaker to react to each other, to also perhaps comment on the findings, on the analysis, on the policy proposals. And finally, obviously, you will also have the word, and you will be brought into the discussion, and we'll have a question and answer session, also comments from your side directed towards the podium on what you think are pertinent issues that need to be raised tonight. We will close the conference roughly at 7 p.m. and afterwards you'll be invited to a reception with some drinks and some refreshments. Okay, so I come to the first part of today's conference, the keynote by Jomo Kwame Sundaram. Let me shortly introduce Professor Jomo to you. For those who have been working in development politics, development economics for the last decades, this is certainly a very prominent name, and I'm very happy that you've agreed to come to Vienna tonight. Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram studied at Harvard University and MIT, not really, he told me, but he wanted to, but anyway. And then afterwards, he had a number of academic appointments and positions, but perhaps he's best known for his position as Assistant Director General and Head of the Department for Economic and Social Affairs at UNDESA at the United Nations headquarters in Vienna in the 2000s, to be precise, from 2005 to 2012. He was also Assistant Director General for Economic and Social Development at the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations between 2012 and 2015. Professor Sundaram has published a large variety of both academic publications, and more recently, he's also been very active in, writing for a broader public, doing blogs, particularly via the International Development Economics Associates the Ideas Network, which is a very interesting network of development economists that are very active in organizing conferences, doing commentaries, blogs, and other pieces on issues of topical interest. So welcome to Vienna. I'm very much looking forward to your presentation, which will last more or less 25 minutes. And then we'll go on to hear the comments by our two distinguished commentators. So, Professor Sundaram, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Dr. Raza, for that very kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be here. I also want to acknowledge his contribution to this presentation, which is more than simply inviting me. He actually gave me some very useful critical feedback on the first draft of this presentation. And I tried to change it. I didn't necessarily do a good job in terms of trying to deal with all the issues he raised, but I'm very grateful for his feedback. And the unfortunate thing is that after I prepared the revised version, my computer hard disk crashed. So I have not really seen it. Also, Franz, thank you very much for the joint invitation from Sir and VICD to be here today. So it's good to be in Vienna. I came to Europe via another old imperial capital, Istanbul. And it's very useful for me to reflect on the past, especially because my wife is a historian, but also it is useful to learn lessons from the past. There are many lessons which we need to learn from the past. Slightly unusual approach to the set of issues Franz reminded us of for discussion. And what I am going to try to do is to also relate some of the issues which do not necessarily form part of the conversation around the whole question of hunger today. It is not that hunger is not a pressing issue. I think it is a very serious problem. I think it is important for us to recognize that the old figures on hunger probably give you a bit of an understatement, because the definition is actually very strict. You have to be chronically hungry for a year. That is the definition to be considered hungry. With that kind of a definition, you can imagine that if you're a farmer and you eat during harvest and then you don't eat much for the rest of the year, it can be very problematic. Many people have this old image of farming being essentially a male activity, when in fact, in many parts of Africa, it is women who do much of the farming, and it's not just an African phenomenon, it is also a South Asian phenomenon, and arguably in many parts of Central America, if not elsewhere. So I think what we have a lot of misconceptions about what constitutes farming today. And of course, we know that the very small proportion of the population actually lives in the countryside compared to, say, half a century ago. And what all this means, and many of them have been encouraged, they've been discouraged from producing food, they've been encouraged to instead produce other crops, which supposedly would give them a higher income. So drawn into a market system, but the market system doesn't just, it's not just a question of borrowing, of buying and selling through the market. It also means borrowing and indebtedness and a whole range of other issues which you need to think about as well. So the issues are actually quite mixed and cannot be summarized in a very brief period of time. But what I would like to do in the next few minutes is to try to
Which slide?
Let me pointing at this. Yeah. What we need to try to think about as we are thinking about the fear of hunger is the fact that increasingly we have to recognize that the official traditional method of measuring hunger focuses on calorie intake. If we don't have enough proteins, doesn't matter. If we don't have enough micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, it doesn't matter. No matter how much the physical development or your intellectual development is compromised because of that. So I think it's very important for us to recognize the limitations of our measures. And this is why one of my responsibilities in 2014 was to organize the second international conference on nutrition. And I was very fortunate that the Pope and others supported this effort. But unfortunately, there has not been any follow-up, because the collaboration which is involved was a collaboration with FAO and the WHO. And in my own country, for example, I have been trying without any success to get the Ministry of Agriculture involved in discussions about nutrition. No success. The discussions on the Ministry of Health on nutrition is very, very limited, and so on and so forth. If you look at the major impact in terms of nutrition in many parts of the world, one of the first places in the world to introduce a school feeding program was Japan about a century ago. And who lives longer than anybody else in the world today? Japanese. If you think about what Lula achieved, he basically consolidated the different bolsas which were already created, expanded the scope of coverage of those bolsas, and integrated the relationship between attending school and getting a meal. And a meal which was nutritionally balanced, not necessarily terribly expensive, but nutritionally balanced. Why do women, for example, in India, prefer to have food rather than cash? Are they irrational that they reject cash and they prefer to have food? I think these are many issues which we often have important policy implications, which we don't think about very much in the world of policy making and why it is important. But the other point, which I think is very important, is the relationship between the focus historically has been on hunger, and I would urge a greater attention to hidden hunger, inadequate vitamins and other micronutrients, especially minerals. These are very important. And I want to bring your attention to the comments of Dr. Srinath Reddy, who is the chair of the Public Health Foundation in India. And Srinath Reddy has basically made an argument that we normally think in terms of human development, in terms of nature versus nurture. That has been the old debate. But in fact, nurture transforms nature. If a girl child especially is compromised because of poor nutrition, her ability to reproduce is impaired, but more importantly, the children she bears will also suffer scars from her own impairment. So in a sense, the nature of the mother has been transformed by the nurturing of the mother. So I think we really need to think about many of these issues. This has apparently been medically established. I'm no medical doctor, but I think it is important for us to begin to think about this. And we have a situation now where as a lot of manual work has been mechanized and increasingly automated now in the digital age, we also see that diets need to change, and diets are not easy to change. And we have a whole range of what I call diet-related non-communicable diseases. And the number of people suffering type 2 diabetes, for example, is a very, very serious problem. Not only in the rich countries, it's also happening in Central American countries, for example, and many other so-called middle-income countries. These are very, very serious issues. And I would say even in some many poor countries, these are issues. So we need to pay attention, far more attention to some of these matters.
Our online audience asks if you can speak up.
Okay, where is the microphone?
Yeah.
So I won't go through all this slide very carefully because I know I'm already running out of time. But I think it's important for us to recognize that there are many, many dimensions, and the number of people who are considered to be hungry today, the food insecure today, those numbers are changing almost by the minute. I just want to remind you again that that is always defined in terms of caloric intake, all against for what is considered to be a sedentary lifestyle. Okay? A sedentary lifestyle. I know because I was in charge of these numbers. Couldn't really change that. You can't just simply change the definition. You need an international consensus to change these kinds of definitions. So this is a problem. Okay, but leaving that issue aside, I think the problems are far bigger than simply a question of not enough, there not being enough calories to be Okay. This is something from McKinsey Global Report. It's a focus on the whole question of obesity and some of the costs of obesity. You can just look at the range of issues or problems associated with malnutrition, and obesity alone accounts for about 2 trillion according to McKinsey Global. And I can assure you that many of these estimates have a bias towards the rich countries. You have a lot of people who are obese there and they cost that much. You can be sure that it's not as if there are no obese people in poorer countries, but the estimates of the economic costs are skewed accordingly. So I think let me quickly emphasize the point I was making earlier about nutrition supplements being a very costly solution, and the importance of looking at low-cost options is, of course, a very important policy issue. Now, related to that, of course, is the whole question of diet-related non-communicable diseases. I gave the example of diabetes, type 2 diabetes, but I just want to elaborate a little bit, because now there is a big push by big pharmaceutical companies to extend the range of so-called property ownership. So, for example, naturally occurring substances such as insulin, which are from animals. Naturally occurring substances can be owned by such companies under a new range of what are called 21st century intellectual property rights laws. Okay? This is what distinguishes, for example, the CPTPP. It's a comprehensive and progressive, nothing comprehensive and progressive about it, but it's called the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was first mooted by President Obama as part of the encirclement of China, and then rejected by Trump for a particular reason, which I won't get into right now, and then salvaged by the Japanese, Australian, and perhaps the Singapore government as they try to keep this alliance against China in the Pacific zone alive. So this has certain implications. You can see now almost every public policy decision, even including questions such as this, involve intellectual property partnership. And this is why Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, all want to join the CPTPP, this obscure free trade arrangement. Okay. Now, and without getting into the details, because there's a long debate about this whole question of food systems. It was very controversial last year when the UN actually partnered with something called the World Economic Forum. I'm sure you've all heard of Professor Klaus Schwab. So now the UN partners with a private business organization to organize matters which are supposedly have standing in the international community, which is a precedent as far as international law is concerned. And, Austria being a country where there are often such concerns, this is a very, very important precedent, which I think there should be far more critical questions raised about how lawmaking is to be done. I was yesterday up to this morning in Amsterdam, and Amsterdam, of course, the continued celebration of Mr. Huig de Groot, better known as Hugo Grotius, often credited as being the father of international law. He was basically the one who declared that slavery was acceptable as long as it wasn't in the Netherlands itself, and that the high seas were basically no man's land. And so anything goes, including an act of piracy against a Portuguese ship, which is how Mr. Grotius at the age of 16 attracted the attention of the board of the VOC. The VOC was the East Indian. Of course, he also was very important in terms of the laws involving in the war and so on and so forth. But the point I'm trying to make is that we are still stuck with an international legal framework, largely dictated by a particular tradition which I don't have time to go into right now, but where Akina, yeah, thank you. Akina Pistor and in the law school. He has written an excellent book. I cannot over recommend codification of law and how basically so-called even rights, are codified in law. Now we often hear people saying, let us have rights-based law, and what they think is human rights-based law. Unfortunately, most law is property rights-based law, not human rights-based law. And it's a very, very important challenge when we think about some of these issues as we try to improve the human condition. Now let me move on quickly to two other important elements in my argument. Sorry, I still have a few more slides on the need for greater variety in diets, and to note that commodity prices have basically declined, as we all know, and I'm sure you all know that commodity prices have declined over the course of the since the late 19th century right to the present against manufactured goods. But also equally importantly, and many people do not realize this, is the prices of agricultural products from tropical countries have actually declined against temperate agricultural products. Now, this was shown by the late Arthur Lewis from the Caribbean more than 60 years ago. But it's something which I think is very important to think about why we have these types of relationships. Arthur Lewis has a particular explanation for why this occurs, and Bilge Erten, a Turkish woman economist, has recently updated a lot of this, and this chart is basically from her work. Now, I need not emphasize that the terms of trade in Africa are far worse than for most other regions, and the commodity terms of trade for most LDCs have actually returned to very the dismal conditions which existed soon after the global financial crisis. Now, I think it is important to recognize that increasingly the trends internationally in this age of financialization have been to leave increasingly many initiatives to the private sector, and government initiatives have become increasingly constrained. So even government initiatives are offered to facilitate private sector initiatives, and these go under names such as blended finance and a number of other gimmicks. There was supposedly more progressive president of the World Bank, Jim Kim. You might remember him. He resigned early as president of the World Bank in order to devote his efforts to promoting such new financial arrangements. So you can see that even the role of states, especially in the West, I have to emphasize, is increasingly being subordinated to the interests of private capital, but more specifically to the interests of big finance. And this, I think, surely should be a matter of much concern. It affects farming decisions. It affects the consolidation of agro corporations and so on, in ways which have been well demonstrated in the literature. and I need not go and elaborate on these issues. But I think it's important also to put the core question of food losses and waste into perspective. Let's face it, there is enough food being produced to feed the world. It's not a question of there not being enough food, but there's a great deal of food losses, and losses are usually at the level of production, and the losses are higher in developing countries, undoubtedly, for a number of reasons. For example, you can produce your peanuts, but you cannot keep your peanuts dry. The aflatoxins develop, and this creates a range of problems of their own. And this, of course, has very important implications for the peanut farmers, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of food losses, and food losses are estimated to be in the range of about 30 to 35%. Then there are other losses relating to what is called food waste. And waste, by definition, this is a definitional issue, it's not my analysis, but waste by definition is related to consumption. So for example, if you produce food, food is ready to be consumed, it's available in the supermarkets, but let us say it exceeds the sell-by date. So in some countries, you're obliged to throw away that meat because it has exceeded the sell-by date. And likewise with other types of food and so on and so forth. This is one example of consumer waste, besides the waste you find in restaurants, for example, when you have a buffet, which is where people take much more because there's a strong incentive to take much more than you really are going to consume when you have a buffet, and then you throw away the excess food and so on and so forth. So these are some of the problems we face, but it's not the fundamental problem. So you have 30 to 35% losses, food losses at production, mainly in developing countries, waste mainly at the level of consumption in the richer countries. But the problem is not that there not being enough food. Even a relatively conservative observer like the head of the World Food Program, Josette Chiran, who was the George Bush's deputy USTR, United States Trade Representative, she made this observation during the time of the World Food Crisis, so-called World Food Crisis in 2007, 2008. So I think what we do need to, this should have been a little earlier in terms of the definition. I just want to remind you about what when FAO or others use the word undernourishment, it has historically been defined principally in terms of caloric intake, inadequate caloric intake, against what is considered to be needed for a sedentary lifestyle. Now, undoubtedly, many of us lead sedentary lifestyles, okay, but presumably, the poorer you are, the more manual work you are likely to be doing. Okay, so there is a inverse need for in terms of your caloric needs. Now let me move on to looking at the particular impact of the war on global food security. I think everybody now knows that food prices have generally gone up since then, but I want to emphasize that food prices have also come down more recently. And it's important to recognize that there was the major reason for the prices going up initially was speculative. There's no doubt that it was speculative, but the kind of speculation this time is different from the time of speculation which sent food prices up in 2007, 2008. Because at that time, there was a shortfall, mainly of rice production, because China had lost more than 20% of its harvest to the groundhopper. When China lost that one, and because only 6% of rice output is actually traded internationally, so that has a huge impact on prices. And then you speculate. Now, during the first decade of this century, there was a big increase in what was called in financial investments options. So you're always searching for, to use the business jargon, you're searching for value. Okay, so what better example of value than commodities? Okay, that's value, and it's much more fungible, much more marketable than say real estate. It's not so easy to just buy and sell real estate as you can sell commodities. So you have, and then you have these instruments of hedging, which had been developed in the 20th century, where you basically had futures and options markets available. And so this became a new class of assets, of financial investments. But when you have, then you have much more index trading and companies offering you a range of commodities in which you would invest. And say, my company would offer you 12 weighted in a particular kind of way, and we would have an algorithm to decide when to move in A, B, and C, when to move out of A into B, and so on and so forth. My algorithm will be different from the next company, and so on and so forth. And this is a range of choice for financial investors. And this was basically what happened. But whatever it is, the point is that there was a bias towards the financial asset. So as a consequence, when you have interest and you lose interest in other asset classes and you move to this, you send prices up. And at a particular time, those prices come down. So the particular type of speculation and the motivation for the speculation and the consequences of that speculation differ at that time from the more recent episode. And I suspect that it will differ again when the next round happens. The point is that history doesn't simply repeat itself. There are some similarities. It's important for us to recognize the similarities, but also to recognize differences, and the differences can be differences of substance, differences of context, and so on and so forth. So this is, I think, extremely important as we think about the nature of the speculation and the cause of the speculation, and why trying to understand prices going up and down and so on. I'm running out of time, so let me quickly move on to emphasizing that we have a very serious problem today of what I would call stagflation. The term was first used, some of you may be old enough, I suspect very few of you are old enough to remember the last time the term stagflation was used during the late 1970s. But at that time, there was an economic slowdown, especially after the Nixon withdrew from the Bretton Woods system. The Bretton Woods system was gone. There was international monetary chaos. My guru, Robert Triffin, called it international. We developed a non-system, international monetary non-system. And in that chaos, you had basically other inherent tendencies to contract. You didn't know what to expect next because there were no more rules. And so the result was that was contractionary. Of course, labor was largely blamed for it. Labor was supposedly more militant. Certainly it's more militant then than it is now. But nonetheless, it was not such a powerful force to, and it's wrong to, factually, it was wrong to blame it on labor. But in any case, it was done. And you then had Mr. Volcker coming in from 1979, 1980, 1981, pushing up interest rates to almost 20%. Overnight rates went up. Can you imagine 20% rates in the US? And he successfully killed that inflation, but he basically wiped out the prospects for growth for much of the world, especially for African countries which had borrowed heavily, and especially, of course, we all hear about the Latin American debt, which was much bigger, but for African countries, it was proportionately very, very significant. The result was that African and Latin American countries had to adopt structural adjustment programs, which basically condemned them to losing, in the case of Latin America, at least a decade. In the case of Africa, I would even argue almost a quarter century. The point is that this was a very devastating impact, and we need. So now we have a situation where, for different reasons, you have again a stagnation. You have the tendencies for economic slowdown, for contraction. At the same time, you have inflation. And this, I think, is a very, very dangerous situation, which we need to think about today. So you have these tendencies, which are now being accentuated by not only by war, okay, and war certainly worsens supply lines, but even before the supply side shocks, remember the pandemic, how it disrupted deliveries, and also remember what Mr. Trump and Mr. Abe did. Trump and Abe both said, let us start this so-called reshoring, taking investments out of China, and bring them back to the US and to Japan. And it was too expensive to produce in the US and Japan. So now they have this new thing called friendshoring, okay? Put them in friendly countries. So you can imagine what this new Cold War is going to be like. Okay? And then now you have economic sanctions, and there are no rules for economic sanctions because you basically ignore the UN, and you basically do anything you like against whomever you like. So you can pull off certain things with certain countries because they are too weak to retaliate, but you can't pull off certain things with, say, Saudi Arabia, because, you know, Saudi Arabia is, you know, has some means of retaliation. So this is a world of, we are now living in a very, very dangerous world. We are living in a very dangerous world where we do not recognize the other forms of warfare which are taking place, especially the economic warfare taking place. And this is part of the reason why we are living in a very, very dangerous world. The implications for food and fertilizer supplies and so on are extremely, are already quite well known. I just want to emphasize that we need to recognize that many of the old problems continue to exist today, but at the same time, we are now having to deal with a larger context where, in a sense, addressing some of those old problems is not going to do the trick. Far, far more is needed in terms of addressing some of the challenges which we have in the world today. And I think for this reason, if nothing else, we really need to begin to think about the dilemmas which we face in the world today. The dilemmas which not only the developing world, because in many ways, I've been in Europe for a week, and I've actually, I never imagined I would ever come to a Europe like this. You know, the people who are unsure about whether they're going to be keep warm enough this winter and so on and so forth. This is a very different world which we are living in, and incentives for international cooperation are so abysmal. You know, having a Cold War may not necessarily be a bad thing. The Soviet Union challenged Jimmy Carter in 1979 to wiping out smallpox. And they agreed to do that. And within 1 decade, smallpox was history. By 1989, smallpox was over in the world. It can be done. But there have to be the correct incentives for that to work. It's not going to happen on its own. And unfortunately, all the incentives which we are aware of right now are pointing in the wrong direction. And this is the danger which we face in the world today. So I want to thank you all for your attention. I'm sorry I took liberties with the time, and I hope it has been some interest to you. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much, Professor Sundaram, for this very interesting and comprehensive talk. Let me take the opportunity to also welcome our guests who are with us via Facebook stream and also via Zoom. And that brings me to also our two commentators. Professor Sundaram has mentioned that since COVID, we all have learned how to deal with digital technologies. So we try to profit from that today, and have invited two speakers that come from very different places, but nevertheless will be with us via Zoom. So I'm now going to introduce our two commentators. I will start with Sofía Monsalve Suárez, who's the Secretary General of FIAN International. FIAN International is a international human rights organization working for the right to food and nutrition. So Sofía, welcome with us. I hope you can hear and see us.
Yes, thank you very much. Good afternoon to you all.
Good afternoon to you. Thanks a lot for joining us. Sofía is also a member of the International Panel on Experts on Sustainable Food Systems, the IPES Food Network, which is doing very interesting work also on the global food system. Professor Sundaram is also a member of that network, by the way. So we wanted to bring in activism and advocacy for a different global food system, and FIAN is one of the most important advocacy groups in that respect. So I'm looking forward to your comments, Sofía, both on the presentation by Professor Sundaram, but also particularly how you see the problems and what you think must be done in order to improve our global food system. So please take the floor for your comments.
Yes, thank you very much, Werner. And yeah, thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to join this interesting conversation. Well, perhaps you won't be surprised that we as FIAN, as a human rights organization, but also we as part of the food sovereignty movement, have a sort of cautious take on the global food system. So when the title of this talk, of this conference today is to secure global supplies, and if our discussion revolves very much around the global food systems, you are of course making the assumption that it is good to have a globalized food system. And the food sovereignty movement was born precisely to challenge that assumption, to challenge the idea that it is better to dismantle national capacities of food production, what happened in the 80s in the course of structural adjustment programs, what Jomo just said in his talk, that it is better to dismantle that and concentrate on producing, you know, what each country has as a comparative advantage to others, and rely on a global food security strategy, meaning that you will rely on importing food, even staples, from far away. So we think that this is one of the main problems that we have today, that these national capacities and local capacities of food production were destroyed. And public institutions like for food reserves, for rural extension services, public distribution systems were largely dismantled and privatized. So it is not by chance that we see today really very large corporations controlling inputs, controlling distribution systems, and controlling also retail. So all this has been made. It were deliberate choices. So to shape food systems in a way that are really extremely dependent on global supply chains. And now we have seen during the pandemic, and now with the war in Ukraine, that this is an extremely fragile strategy, because of these dependencies to produce their own food, because you are dependent on global food prices. And if you don't have enough cash and enough currency to buy these foods, then you are really in trouble. So this is, I think, one of the issues that I wanted to highlight. We have a global economic architecture, and I think I agree with Jomo or what he elaborated in terms of trade, in terms of finances, that it is extremely unjust and has concentrated simply too much wealth in few hands. So I would highlight that the problem of inequality, wealth concentration, but also the problem of land concentration, because I think we have been talking too much about food systems, but we have all forgotten about land. So land is highly concentrated worldwide, and this is of course a problem because small-scale farming is more or less on the path of extinction. And this is a problem, and this is connected also to what Jomo said, that we have diets and food habits which have been shaped by corporations, ultra-processed foods, and I think there is a clear correlation between free trade and changes in habits, relying more on ultra-processed food, which has led to these massive problems with communicable diseases related to food. So all this is connected, and if we want to diversify foods, we need to strengthen stop the ecological destruction, stop the destruction of biodiversity, restore many of these ecosystems, restore soil, health of soils, clean water, clean air, and then find different ways of producing food, like for instance, agroecology, which is much more healthy and just. So I think I think that this is a very important structural problem. Jomo didn't talk about patriarchy, and I think it is very important to highlight. He said that women are responsible for agriculture in many countries, but I think patriarchy is really the problem, because we have an economic system which overexploits reproductive work, care work, and this is put on the shoulders of women and girls. And we see that the pandemic showed us again how important is this work, but how overexploited it is. And I think in agriculture, we also have an important care dimension, not only for feeding children and the elderly and the ill, but also for caring for ecosystems, for animals, for plants. And this is work which is extremely important, but it is hidden and overexploited. And I think also the corporate global supply chains rely heavily also on women, on female work, but violence, sexual harassment and gender violence across the chain. I mean, you can talk with workers in plantations, tea plantations, flower plantations. These are all female workers. And I think we have testimonies, we have heard many testimonies of these women who cannot, their salary, access to water is conditioned to sexual favors. So this is really a massive problem, and it is very important. And just to finish, the other component that I think a structural determinant of the problems that we are seeing now related to the food crisis is simply lack of democracy. I think that this large concentration of power in the hands of corporations, but also of some countries, has led to a world and to a system where there are very few people in command deciding what is best for all of us. And I think as a human rights person, and as I said, as part of the food sovereignty movement, we think that, we believe in the principle of self-determination as communities and as peoples and nations. So therefore, we have the right to decide what agricultural and food system we want. And I think that we have seen that democratizing decision-making is one of the first steps if you want to combat hunger. And I think the case of Brazil, the program of Fome Zero, Jomo also related to that, had a very strong component of democratizing decision-making. And therefore, we think that this is very important as well, because at global level, Jomo said, we have geopolitics. So this is the law of the most powerful. And here is the little democracy that we used to have is more or less about to be dismantled. I mean, we are coming out of the last plenary session of the UN Committee on World Food Security, which has been praised as one of the most inclusive and participatory places in the UN system. And basically the session was suspended because it was impossible to get an agreement about what language to use to talk about the war and and the impacts on food security in the world. Yes, so perhaps I just finished my remarks. I agree very much with the proposals made by Jomo in terms of urgent policies. I would add that we need to address the global architecture in terms of debt, curbing speculation, and changing trade rules, and of course creating space for food reserves at national, regional, and global level. But I would add to that, I mean, according to my analysis, of course, the importance of the care economy, of redistributing care work, and of course, strengthening the rights of women and strengthening democracy and decision-making at a multi-scalar level. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sofía, for this introductory comment. Let me bring in our second commentator, which is Faith Lumonya. She is with us from Kampala, Uganda. She's there the head of the Economic Justice and Climate Action Program at the organization Akina Mama Afrika. Faith, are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Hello, good to have you with us. Thanks a lot for joining into our discussion. I just introduced you very shortly. Let me also add that your areas of work mainly focus on economic and climate justice issues while applying gender analysis to inform your initiatives. So as we all know, particularly in the Horn of Africa, there is a crisis situation with respect to hunger, particularly in Somalia. We also know that many African countries, if not the continent as such, is heavily impacted by the effects of the climate crisis. What is your take on the needs, on the things that need to change with respect to agriculture, food production in the region where you come from? What are the immediate needs that you would identify? But also, what do you think are the most structural issues that need to be addressed with respect to making agriculture more sustainable in Africa? So please, we're looking forward to your comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me to this space. It's interesting speaking after Sofía. I think Sofía has really unpacked a lot of the issues that I also had wanted to reflect on, but maybe just to add, like you indicated, for the East Africa region, but also the Horn of Africa, just like you did indicate, the food insecurity problem has been driven by a number of factors. So there's the structural issues, but there's also impact of conflict. We've seen that there've been multi-season droughts, there's been floods, and a number of economic shocks which have affected household food, but also income sources. When you think of countries like, for example, Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Somalia that have been in conflict for a very long period of time, food insecurity has sort of been the situation that these people have experienced. And we've seen that there are children, for instance, that have literally been born into this conflict, into the hunger situation, and therefore have faced malnutrition and continue to grow through that. But also there are countries like, for example, Sudan that have experienced floods, Uganda experienced floods. We know of Kenya, the Turkana region specifically, where there's been the animal mortality rate has increased tremendously, ultimately affecting the food security situation. But so because of the role that food really plays within a lot of our economies, and because agriculture is really the backbone of a lot of our economies, it has meant that the cost of living has gone up, and this has acutely threatened particularly women's livelihood, and then issues to do with health. Obviously, the situation has also been linked to the Ukraine and Russian war, and this has become a go-to excuse for a lot of our governments for the situations of, for instance, increases in food prices. We've seen that, again, there is reason being given to the fact that there's lower supplies of, for instance, corn, wheat, and the globalization, for instance, that Sofía was speaking about is one of those things that has continued to be concerning, because a lot of African food systems were traditionally designed in such a way that societies did produce food and share food, and for instance, with the seed system, they would save the seed and be able to reuse it in the next season. But currently, because of the infiltration of the private sector, and really in the sense that they are coming in to sort of address the problem that we currently face of food insecurity and challenges with food supply, we've seen that traditional food systems and the ways in which society manages seeds is continuously being undermined. And I like that Jomo pointed to the issue around agroecology, because one of the issues that has been raised as a challenge that has resulted from the Ukraine and Russian war is the reduction in the supply of fertilizers and the increment in prices around fertilizers. And yet within our traditional systems, and the approach of agroecology, it was never about relying on chemical fertilizers, which is what we actually import. And so when you talk about food supply and food and the food insecurity situation in our context, you cannot put aside the conversation around seed. We've seen that, for instance, corporations like Syngenta, we've seen corporations like the Bill Gates Foundation coming in to claim to try and solve the food security issue and the nutrition concerns that we have, but really with the intention of maximizing profits in that regard. And so when Jomo mentioned that one of the biggest concerns when you talk about hunger is concerns around nutrition, there are a lot of questions that came to mind because, for instance, in the context of Uganda, there's been investment by particularly Bill Gates investing in genetically modifying the banana, which is a staple food for Ugandans, and modifying it to claim to add vitamin A, which according to researches that have been done is one of the nutrients that a lot of Ugandan children are deficient on. But the reality is that some of these nutrients can be gotten from a variety of foods. When we were growing up, our plates did have an assortment of different foods, and the intention was really to be able to balance out the food nutrients provided for every meal. However, because of the changes that have occurred to our food system and the fact that now there's reliance, increasing reliance on particularly grain as a major food, it has resulted into increasing malnutrition. But just to try and also respond to the question that you raised around what I see as some of the concerns, what I see as some of the things that have actually caused this particular problem. For me, I think the situation is majorly structural, and this is why when we acknowledge that, for instance, conflict and war elsewhere and geopolitical situation and the climate crisis is a contributing factor to the food insecurity situation, I think it's important for us to also discuss and try and unpack the root causes of the problem. And I think Sofía did highlight some of these as well as Jomo. And I think one of the things that we cannot ignore is how neoliberalism has shaped a lot of the ways in which our societies, our countries, and the entire global system is operating. It has created a policy vacuum, and we've seen that with this policy vacuum, a lot of corporations have remained unaccountable. We've seen states abandoning their role, their regulatory role, and neoliberalism, and I mean, this is also something that has been pointed out, the issues to do with privatization, financialization, deregulation, and the liberalization and the attempt to globalize how food moves across the globe, across even our continent, is one of those things that we must be aware of and begin to try to challenge. For us, when you speak about the food insecurity challenges, but also our development challenges as a whole, you can't ignore the contribution that colonialism made in transforming a lot of the ways in which we were operating. Colonialism did shape our dietaries, and recently in a discussion with a couple of comrades, one of the things that we realized was that today, when you think of, for instance, countries like Nigeria, where the skin of a cow is a delicacy, you think that it's naturally occurring, but it's really because of what colonialism and slave trade did, that it was the scraps that were left that then became a delicacy for a lot of African families. And so today we do sit and eat the skin of cows, we do eat the intestines of cows, which we call offals, but it's really because there was a certain system that did influence transformation of our food systems. We can't also ignore the collapse of cooperatives and the rural development system. In Uganda boasted, in the 1970s, Uganda boasted of very effective cooperative systems where there were rules, for instance, on how much of your land would be committed to production of cash crops and how much would have to be committed to production of food. Today, because of the deregulation, that has since changed, and people are now committing their land to production of cash crops, to production for export, and not having any of the land committed to subsistence agriculture. And so the transformation, the changes in the way our land system, in the way land is managed, is also one of the factors that has resulted in to the food insecurity challenges. Urbanization as well. Within a lot of African countries, we've seen youth moving out of rural areas, able and energetic youth moving out of the rural area where a lot of the agriculture production happens, moving into urban centers to drive borders, to set up small kiosks. And really, because the agriculture sector has not been supported, has not been invested in to the level that it is actually one that the youth would like to commit their labor to. Obviously, the issue of land and the emergency of land-based investments in Uganda, and I will give a lot more examples from Uganda. In Uganda, we have a district called Kalangala, which is also an island in Lake Victoria, and that particular more than 1,000 hectares of land, actually forest cover, was given out to a corporation called VIDC to plant oil palm trees. And this particular investment completely transformed the food system in the area, to the extent that this particular district now has to import food from the next district. And so the ways in which such investments do change is also something that needs to also be thought about. Investment in agriculture, and this is something that also Jomo pointed to, how there is increasing, because of financialization, there is increasing trade in money. We've seen increasing trade in digital ware and in non-food investments. And we basically, our governments on the continent have failed to live up to their Maputo protocol commitments of allocating a minimum of 10% of their national budgets. So in the absence of necessary regulations to deal with the looming food crisis, private sector has emerged. But also we can't ignore the role that international financial institutions, particularly the World Bank and IMF, have played, especially with regards to promoting fiscal austerity. We know that, for instance, recently, the IMF did publish their gender strategy, and there was a campaign by civil society to say no to this particular strategy because of the legacy that the IMF, along with the World Bank, have continued to play in terms of promoting the alteration of the ways in which our governments are operating, and have literally really constrained our government's capacities to be able to protect and promote the public interest, later on social welfare. And so thinking about the role of these institutions is also critical, because we need to continue to push back on them. As I conclude, I think for me, in terms of solutions, and I think Sofía really unpacked the fact that, again, women are at the front line of this situation. And when food insecurity does increase the burden of unpaid care and domestic work on women, because ultimately, because of the way society has decided to structure itself, it's women who do carry the burden and responsibility of providing food and ensuring that the family people do have access to the right nutritional requirements. And so in that regard, the solution really is for us to rethink and reimagine different ways of addressing the challenge. And for me today, I would like to propose what for us as Akina Mama referred to as the feminist approach, and believing that when you think about feminism, it's really about centering the needs of those that are at the margins, of those that continue to be minoritized and marginalized. It's based on egalitarianism, and it rejects neoliberalism as a corrupt and abusive system that has simply facilitated underdevelopment. So with feminism focusing on prioritizing the interests of those that are most marginalized, those and placing emphasis on the need to protect not only human beings, but also the environment, and centering the needs of individuals is something that for us, we are advancing. And also reflecting on, for instance, the fact that governments need to center the needs of their people, the needs of those that are most marginalized. One of the things that our government has been in Uganda has been constantly pushing back on is the idea of providing subsidies, whether agricultural or fuel subsidies or whatever subsidies it may be, and claiming that these subsidies do affect the economics, and realizing that, again, for them, it's really about centering the economics and profit is something that we then question, because the responsibility of any state is to place their people at the center. So yeah, I think I have said a lot, but as I conclude, placing emphasis on the ideals of social justice and collective public responses, definitely agreeing with the proposals around rethinking free trade and the ways in which it's been advanced as a magic bullet to addressing a lot of our problems, and then also definitely centering the most marginalized. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Faith. Well, thank you to both of our commentators, Faith and Sofía, for their very interesting points of view, taking into account both the international level and the work that FIAN International is doing, but also the work and the activism that is taking place in Eastern Africa. So I now would like to invite Jomo to join me here on the podium. We're now going to give Jomo the opportunity to shortly react to the two comments, since they've also raised issues that partly were covered by yourself in your talk, but also other new issues that you might want to respond to. But before we do that, just let me perhaps kind of shortly wrap up the discussion. We've heard three very comprehensive inputs, and I think we can kind of try to structure that a little bit. I mean, I would argue that obviously there's a lots of problems on the international level. When we refer to the global food system, it was critically remarked by Sofía that globalization, neoliberal globalization obviously has increased the importance and the influence of, what I would call the agro-industrial complex, that is transnational corporations in the food sector, the trading houses that are very active on international commodity exchanges, the whole IPR system that has emerged, the intellectual property rights system that has obviously been promoted by these companies for the sake of privatizing seeds, other inputs, other intellectual property rights. The role of financialization, you have elaborated on that also, the two commentators, and the role that has played in terms of influencing the way commodity exchanges work, and the volatility and instability that emerges from the work of international commodity markets. So there's a whole set of issues on the international level, the whole of private foundations, et cetera, et cetera. I would also argue that what we've learned is that particularly from our commentators, that it is very important to look at the ground where agricultural production takes place, and the issues that emerge, say, in stressed areas of Africa in terms of agricultural production under a situation where extreme weather events, the effects of the climate catastrophe, make it increasingly difficult to produce, but nevertheless, where there's certainly a need to kind of make those local food systems, regional food systems more resilient, more sustainable, also perhaps more productive. And there's certainly also a need for a different set of national and regional policies in, say, in many African countries, perhaps also for cooperation, because if it's the case that there are natural weather events that affect the harvests in certain regions, in certain countries, there might be a necessity to cooperate on a regional level so as to promote say regional food banks, food reserves, all these kinds of issues that have been posed on the kind of the local and regional level. So there is certainly this case for looking on the ground also for different policies from the bottom up. So a lot of issues were raised. Difficult to respond to all of those, but nevertheless, I give you the floor to react to the comments as you see fit, and then we want to bring in the audience here, potentially also the audience via Zoom and via Facebook. So the audience via Zoom and Facebook has the opportunity to ask questions via the chat function. And our two colleagues, Hannes and Mael, will then also kind of read any questions and comments that emerge from our online audiences. But first to you, and then we open the discussion to the floor. You can sit if you want.
I'll just stand for a few minutes while responding to some general comments. I think the premise I began with is really not the ideal world which we want, but rather trying to identify the nature of the problems which we face right now, the difficulties of addressing some of those problems, but also defining the problems more pragmatically, if you will, because I think there is a lot of problematic understanding in the public at large and among influential policymakers, which are extremely important. And this, I think, has become worse because there's a tendency to see problems as continuing problems and not enough attention to recognizing how certain phenomena may well continue, certain trends may well continue, but because the context has changed, the nature of the problem itself has changed. And dealing with that problem becomes much more challenging as a consequence. That's a general statement I'd like to begin with. I would like to acknowledge Sofia's very important point about the care economy. I would actually go so far as to suggest that the nature of food production, of what is historically referred to as subsistence food production, has largely been appropriated largely in a new division of labor by women. And so even food production and the provisioning of food and nutrition, I want to emphasize, has become feminized in very, very important ways, especially in the rural economy. So it is the cash crops, which much of the cash crop production may be by women, but it is more, it is what is measured much more, it is monetized much more. And this has very important implications. If you think, for example, about the farmer suicides in India, there are almost 500,000 farmer suicides in India over the recent 15 years or so, as reported by a very courageous journalist named Sainath. And the very nature of debt is that it is the borrower, and often the borrower is the male, producing the cash crop. When the cash crop fails, the debt is borne by the male. So actually suicide becomes a male option. Okay? It's not that women do not commit suicide. Women commit suicide for a whole range of reasons, but there, in that situation, because it is the male who is bearing the credit, so you have very, very complex interactions, genderized interactions which affect this. But the point I was trying to make really is that the very understanding, our very understanding of the care economy includes the whole question of food production and, in fact, even consumption, because it is very often the gender division of labor at the household level involves the preparation of food largely under the responsibility of women. So this, I think, raises very important questions about how we think about the care economy in place. I must admit that I did some work on this in the 1980s. It's been a long time since I revisited these issues. Partly because, at least in my own society, the nature of the rural economy has been transformed so radically. In those days, we used to be very involved in debates. There were people who felt that, that the introduction of mechanized machines was displacing women, and undoubtedly they were displacing women. But was that a good thing or a bad thing? Because the women's work in transplanting seeds from the nursery to the main field, as well as the women's work in harvesting, particularly a form of harvesting which involved literally bending over, is really backbreaking. It's literally backbreaking. So is the mechanization of such work to be a real thing? Because it displaced women, was that a boon or a bane? Now, in the case of Malaysia, many of those, the younger generation of women were subsequently employed in factories. In many other societies, we displace, we do not have any other employment option. So these are very important issues which we face in many societies, and it's not as if it's black and white. The point I would like to make is on Faith's point about the very nature the very nature of many of the ostensible solutions by very well-meaning people. Some have referred to it as the white man's burden and so on and so forth. But I think a lot of the scientists involved are very well-meaning. There's no doubt about that. But very often they have defined options available are defined by those who perceive and define the problems in particular ways. So, for example, in Asia, so-called golden rice was defined as the problem. So the only funding the International Rice Research Institute was getting was for developing the so-called golden rice to add a bit of vitamin D to rice, when you can get vitamin D from other sources quite cheaply and quite easily. Or in Faith's example earlier, you have the addition, but she knows very well, in East Africa and other parts of Africa as well, you have the sweet potato, the orange colored sweet potato, which actually the orange comes from beta carotene, and that really does a lot for eyesight. And so there are actually already existing options which have been to some extent marginalized in favor of other options. And then we have very interesting work, for example, which involves genetic modification, but not genetic engineering. Genetic modification can be a natural process, completely natural process. The very nature of evolution is such that there is genetic modification. But in the particular case I'm thinking of, for example, there is a scientist in 2009 who got the so-called World Food Prize, or the Bolog Prize, as it is sometimes referred to. He's an Oromo from Eastern Ethiopia. He worked in the University of Khartoum, and he developed a drought-resistant sorghum. Okay? using 300 different varieties. He did a lot of hybrid development until he developed a drought-resistant sorghum, and he was given this prize, and an American university hired him, gave him a very nice and comfortable chair. He moved to the US, but he refused. He refused to have intellectual property rights for, and he didn't refuse to have his drought-resistant sorghum something to be sold. He said anybody can do it, and it should be available to everybody. And this is the attitude of, say, Jonas Salk when he developed the polio vaccine. He said, "How can I sell this? How can I have a patent on this? It is like trying to patent the sun." No, but now, the motivation in many universities, including the university I used to work in, is, you are rewarded, you're acknowledged precisely because of the potential commercial value of your development. So as I was working here, for example, you have an Institute of Theoretical Physics. They will never get any prize because it's very unlikely that theoretical physicists are going to develop anything which is of immediate commercial value.
We just had a Nobel laureate in this department.
I doubt he has patented anything. So congratulations to him. I don't know the nature of this work, but the point I'm trying to make is that rather than recognize the work of generations of farmers and options which are available and easily transferable, among many societies, and I'm not excluding European societies or North American societies. These are all available. We instead have a view that the only kind of innovation which is to be valued is precisely because it has a market value, which raises another problem. And relates in a sense to something which was touched on by both the commentators, and that is that this was pointed out by another colleague of ours, Mamadou Goita, who pointed out that in Africa, the situation is not as bad as we think it is, precisely because a great deal of food production does not go through the market and is not measured through the market, but is available to human beings. And that mitigates the impact of deprivations. I'm not suggesting that that is the future, but it forces us to think about the implications of what Sofía was saying in terms of the food sovereignty movement, because people often dismiss its potential precisely because they are fixated on the market measurement of food production. Let me stop here, and I hope everybody else can join in the debate. Thank you.
So we still have 20 minutes before you have deserved your glass of wine or water or whatever. So let me bring you into the discussion. If you have any questions directed to Jomo or Sofía and Faith, please raise your hand and be precise and concise so that we'll have a chance to receive many of your questions or comments, both here in the audience in the Center for International Development, but also, of course, from those people who are with us via Facebook or Zoom. So who wants to take the floor first here? I start perhaps with some questions and comments from here, the room, and then we move on to see whether there have been any questions raised in the chat function. So we have now again Faith and Sofía with us. Hopefully they can hear and see us, and the technical equipment functions until the end of this conference. Okay, so who wants to take the floor? Karin, please.
Thank you very much for your interesting remarks. I have maybe 2 or 3 questions. One question would be on the role of maybe minimum prices. I mean, I've been working in a project in India in the past years where there's a minimum price for sugarcane, which is historically was historically established, but doesn't make any sense anymore because sugar is not a nutritious crop and needs a lot of water. But still, a lot of farmers grow sugarcane because it's the only crop that guarantees them a minimum price. And there is no minimum price for onions, for tomatoes, for potatoes, whatever. But what would be much more important for nutrition? So, would you argue for having minimum prices for basic food so farmers can have a guaranteed income and a guaranteed that they can grow what is nutrition for the population? Would be one question. The other question would be that a lot of especially cash crops are not at all climate adapted. Like they use, like in Jordan, for example, there's a lot of cash crops that use a lot of water, like watermelons and tomatoes. Is there any discussion within the UN, for instance, that for an international kind of advice how to change, like how to change crops, how to kind of coordinate this, that crops are climately adapted and don't use so much water, and how this can be improved, and how advice can be more given to farmers, and how support could be more given in terms of growing crops that are better adapted to climate conditions. And the third question will be, because you have been working a lot on financial markets, have you seen any change in financial markets, in commodity speculation in the past 10, 15 years? I mean, there was a lot of discussion in 2008, 9, 10 on commodity speculation. Is there any, has it become worse, or is there anything that you have noticed that there is a qualitative change in the ways financial markets act on the commodity markets?
Okay, thank you, Karin, for these questions. Are there any other questions? Yes, please, the lady.
Hello, my name is Ying. I'm a PhD student of University of Vienna. I'm doing Africa studies, especially African migrants. It's very interesting to hear that Sofía and your response regarding regarding introducing feminism to define the problems, and I'm interested in like what do you think the migration and the food productions is migrants can be a solution for today's food production, or can they bring in can they be a kind of bring positive or negative impact on today's food production? Especially, you know, we have wars everywhere. We have received a lot of refugees, migrants. Would be a kind of chance to let them into join the food production. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please, gentlemen.
I'm just a lay person, but I'm interested in some things that weren't covered very much. And that includes things like some alternative food supplies like insects or seaweeds and grasses and things. I wonder if you all could talk about that a little bit. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Okay, are there any questions in the chat so far? Okay, so then I give back. So I suppose these questions were all primarily related to Jomo. So first, Jomo, I give you the floor, and then
prices to connect.
Yeah, and then also Faith and Sofía might come in.
Thank you very much for a very interesting set of questions. I would say that let me try to go through them so that we have more time for others who might want to raise some follow-up issues. On the question of minimum prices, it's very context specific. Generally speaking, when you run a system of minimum prices, there is a subsidy, and the subsidy can be borne by the consumer. The subsidy can also be borne by governments. And so the question is how you organize that. And then there are alternative ways of organizing subsidies and provisioning. So, for example, one of the big things a lot of people have been talking about in recent years is, for example, a basic minimum income for everybody. Okay, there are all kinds of names for that, but you're familiar with this. Now the question is that a superior system to this? Okay, there are different ways you can organize this. So the basic question is social provisioning, and how do we ensure adequate social provisioning? Now, in most developing countries, it has been almost impossible to sustain social provisioning. If you take basic things which involve food security, for example, in all rich countries, there are subsidies for farmers, especially for food production. But generally in poor countries, nobody can afford subsidies. In some upper middle income countries, there might be some subsidies. Now, so the question is, what is the most efficient? But what do we mean by efficiency? Efficient for what? So there are very fundamental issues, and minimum prices is one particular mechanism among many, and it incentivizes, as you correctly point out, on particular crops. But these are among options available. But we are talking about a variety of issues. So if you have tremendous social mobilization around certain things, it is simply, although an economist might say, oh, the most efficient option is actually W, and the debate is around A and B and C. I mean, how do you introduce W, So I think one has to be sensitive also to history, to the fact that people have been mobilizing and thinking about certain issues, and so the second question you raised was on the question of how to incentivize certain types of cash crops and so on. Which then leads to a larger question is, you see, the incentives basically take the market mechanism as optimum, and it's a question of tweaking those incentives, so-called market incentives. Is that the best way to organize society? May well be. There might be other ways of organizing society. So I think it goes back to the first question, in a sense, how you organize, whether or not one considers social provisioning possible, especially for developing countries, and what is the optimum way of organizing that kind of social provisioning. So these are very, very fundamental issues which are raised both in the first and second question. So I would put it in those terms. You see, you can have a situation where the debates are being shaped by certain, so the common term nowadays is influencers, right? And who are the big influencers. I mean, you take something like the Guardian. Okay, for many people think of the Guardian newspaper as the font of knowledge on so many things, on at least as far as daily newspapers are concerned. But who sponsors the Guardian development pages? It's the Gates. Okay, so we have to really think what we are talking about when we define options. I mean, there's a lot of interest and it's desirable on questions of climate mitigation, climate adaptation, and so on and so forth. But how much of it is shaped by influences, and how much of it is shaped by popular interest? And popular interests are very varied in different contexts. So it is a very difficult problem, but I don't see personally, and maybe Sofía, who represents an international coalition, has a much better answer than I'm sure she has a better answer than I have to offer. Now the
role of commodity exchanges and how financialization has changed, or what kind of regulatory improvements have been made or not?
Yeah. I think one of the things about finance is that finance is generally often quite fluid, yeah, and how you can move so quickly. So you put your money into speculation on futures at a certain time, and then you realize that's not going to make much more money. You can move it quite elsewhere. And now it's a slightly more difficult because interest rates have gone up. But for many of these people, it's a question of choosing between options. So you so-called ESG, for example, and how is ESG measured? Okay, so if you do something vaguely related to the environment and so on, you can still tick off your ESG boxes. These are the new shape of how decision making is being made in the world of finance, and one cannot give a simple answer to what is obviously a very complex and constantly changing creature. The Ying raised the question of feminism. I don't identify myself as a feminist. Others do, and I happen to be on the board of the Journal of Feminist Economics. Sorry, and I've been from the outset. But it's. I think the board knew that I don't define myself as any particular kind of economist, Keynesian or whatever. So I'm very eclectic and perhaps more fundamentally pragmatic. Okay, so I'm often have to deal with very different audiences, having been a UN bureaucrat on the one hand, and also being an academic and often working with civil society movements and so on. So often people might see what I say as being contradictory. I mean, I remember writing about care economy in the 1980s when nobody was even discussing it, at least in Malaysia, and now nobody even remembers it. This is the nature of life. You also raised the question of the whole question of migration. I think that's tremendous. Let's face it, migrant workers have been used in food production all over the world. You think about who did the lettuce harvesting in the United States for years. That was the basis for the United Farm Workers, which was basically Mexican Americans, or actually Mexicans, who were basically migrant workers who were organizing. There were workers who were brought into from the Philippines, from Japan, from China, into Hawaii to work the land. And all over the world, in Europe, likewise, the number of workers who migrate, particularly in farm production, because they are less visible when you're working on a farm. They're less visible, and so you often do not recognize them as different. They may be darker, but you think, oh, it's because they've been exposed to the sun much more. And this is true even in Thailand, where you have a lot of labor from Myanmar, but nobody talks about them, and it's very under research and so on. But they are very. But the big issue, of course, is that they never have land rights. Okay, I mean, one or two exceptions.
They perhaps have no labor rights also. No.
Well, they have compromise. I mean, ultimately, your right, your ability to work is your only bargaining tool, right? Just like in any society where you don't have any so that is quite important, and sometimes you have different forms of organization. Sometimes you have forms of organization which are deemed by society to be antisocial. I mean, what is the Cosa Nostra? Okay, the Cosa Nostra is a self-protection society. The Chinese secret societies, the Mexican, the Sicilian mafia, etc., etc. These are all poor people getting together initially in their own self-interest. They might subsequently morph into something else. So I think it's anyway. Let me just quickly go on to the last question. The food supplies. I mean, what you say is already happening. I remember when I was in Rome. The FAO came up with a report on insect foods. It's actually many insects are eaten all over the world in different forms. You might have it at very rarely at the egg stage, but certainly at the larval stage, as well as the final stage. insects are eaten all over the world. I remember having locusts in several societies, and they're very crunchy. But for some people, I remember the FAO being mocked, particularly in the American media, for even thinking about consuming insects. And now there is a lot of discussion saying that this is actually very, very efficient way to get certain types of micronutrients, particularly at the larval stage of the insect's evolution. As far as seaweed is concerned, again, one Japanese seaweed, kelp is basically dried kelp, and so on and so forth. So a lot of this is actually already historically for long been very much part of human consumption. It is just that it is often seen by contemporary Western standards as exotic. Okay? But I'm told even that in ancient Rome, for example, there were some such foods being eaten. So let me stop.
Okay. Well, okay, thank you. Let's bring Sofía and Faith into the discussion. Faith, would you like to start?
Yes, sure. So I thought I would just try and respond to 2 questions, and then let Sofía and Jomo address the others. So one was about the issue of minimum prices, and maybe just to say, and using the example that that the person who asked the question, sorry, I didn't get your name, used around sugarcane to share the experience of Uganda. So, and I completely agree regarding the minimum price for sugarcane. And it's also possible that it's been structurally designed that way, because when you think about it, the prices are determined by the corporations that that actually buy the sugarcane from the communities that are growing it. And currently, sugarcane prices are at between 21 to 25 US$ a ton. And communities that are actually involved in growing sugarcane cannot even afford the sugar that is produced by these corporations. So the prices are, yes, there is a minimum price, but it's not determined through engagement with the communities that are involved in its production. And I think that then brings in the point that Sofía raised earlier around democracy, because I think with the continuous reduction in democracy and leaving decision-making to be in the hands of a few, in the hands of those that are really seeking to maximize profits, this is exactly what happens. And then the other that I thought I would try and respond to is the issue around migration. And yes, so in a country like Uganda, which is, I think at the moment, that's either the second largest or the largest hosts of refugees, we've actually realized that
Okay, Sofía, are you with us so that we might change to you and see whether the connection reestablishes itself with Faith? Okay.
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions. Well, perhaps on prices, I agree with Jomo that this is context matters a lot, and it depends on many different factors. Well, I'm originally from Colombia, and just to share with you, as Faith was doing, examples from where we come from. And in Colombia, one of the crops with minimum prices is coca. the coca leaves, drug traffickers ensured basic minimum price for farmers, and that is why they go into the business of growing coca, of course. So for the government, I mean, the challenge is, of course, to ensure minimum prices for other issues like food, for instance. And there is where the problem starts, because the government doesn't want to do that. So I think that, yeah, it's a complex issue. In any case, I've seen also discussions in India, for instance, that the minimum price that the public stockholding system has, I've seen demands that they should guarantee not only for staples, but also for pulses and other food crops, which are very important for the diversity of diets. And of course, these minimum prices are a very important element also to shape diets, in the sense that I take again the case of Colombia, for instance. We see lots of subsidies going into sugarcane production and palm oil, and they are, you know, the key ingredients for ultra processed foods. So it's no wonder that we have an agricultural system which is favoring or over subsidizing the production of sugar and fats, whereas the production of vegetables, fruits, and other very important foods for nutrition is completely neglected. So I think that, well, this is one of the comments I wanted to do. And then the other one on how to change crops and to get crops more adapted to the climate conditions. I think that, and I think Faith referred to that, many farmers, communities engaged, for instance, in this transition to agroecology, are very much interested in also regaining again lost crops, basically almost lost crops, right? And in fostering and again agro biodiversity. And I think this is happening. This is not is happening, perhaps not at the scale that we need. But I think what I wanted to say a bit is that this is not being organized from, you know, from above, from the governments, you know, because I think we have to be very careful with, I mean, concentration in commercial seeds is one of the problems that we have, and all the problems related to intellectual property rights and of a seed system that has displaced indigenous and peasant seed systems. And this is, I think, the huge problem that we have, that actually the solution is much more to strengthen these indigenous and peasant seed systems, because they are much closer to being able to restore biodiversity. So in that sense, I think that I would say that probably one of the most important measures to take in order to have crops which are adapted to climate change is to strengthen these peasant systems, and this start, for instance, with the legal recognition. We don't have almost in the large majority of countries, we don't have legal systems protecting these indigenous and peasant seed systems. We have very strong property rights systems for industrial seeds. And therefore, I would say that this is a key measure. And the last comment on the financial markets, I'm not an economist, I'm not an expert in that, but I understand that the measures that we're taking after the food crisis and in 2008 and 2009 were completely insufficient. Basically, it was about making the information systems more transparent, right? About having a little bit more of information in terms of the positions and in terms of or what happens in the financial markets on derivatives and so on and so forth. But this is clearly insufficient. So it's hard to, I understand that it is hard to say that it has become worse. It's extremely significant and relevant, and I think Jomo said that probably in the spike of prices that we saw at the beginning of this year, speculation played a major role. But what it is compared to the crisis last time is that we don't see any discussion at all at UN level about how to curb speculation. So it's complete silence about that, and this is of course very problematic. Unfortunately, I have to leave now, so I apologize for that, but I thank you again for this invitation and for the very interesting exchange with the panel and with the audience. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very good evening. Bye-bye.
Okay, so we are basically running out of time. We've now spent more than 2 hours already, but there seems to be still a question. The gentleman over there, perhaps you would like to raise the question over a glass of wine with Professor Jomo, and he gives you a 5-minute personal.
Only a short question. Why it's possible that big agro companies sell seeds, which works only 1 year? And the farmers are, they have to buy every year new seed, whether they have the money or not. Whether they have money to buy the seeds, why it's possible.
Well, monopolization of knowledge is probably the short answer. That pays off quite good profits. Okay, so I think we have to wrap up. I thank you very much. Is Faith with us? Faith, can you hear us?
Yes, I am. Yes, I am. Sorry.
I will give you the final word, but only if you promise to be short, because people are getting thirsty and hungry here. So you will have the final word. Let me start by saying thank you to all of our audiences, both here in the conference room, but also via Facebook and Zoom. Let me also thank all our speakers, particularly Faith, Lumonya, Sofía, Monsalve, Suárez, and our guest here in the room, Professor Jomo Kwame Sundaram. I hope it was an interesting discussion for you. Obviously, we raised really a lot of issues, but I think it is quite a good time to raise all these issues, because what we see, obviously because of a very bad situation with the war in Ukraine, is that our not only food system, the energy system, all of our kind of basic needs and the systems that support these basic needs are very vulnerable and are not resilient at all. And I think that has been one of our motivations to organize this conference, because we think that we need to think differently about how we provision the goods and services that we need for our daily life. So we need some kind of a different economics and economy also with respect to that. But okay, so thanks a lot, and you're all then invited to join us for a drink. And please fill in the feedback form, which you find beside yourself. So give us your feedback on what you liked about today's conference and what not so much. But okay, Faith, what would be your final word? What is the message that you would want to give us before we go for a drink?
Okay, so I think for me, my message is really to remind all of us to center human rights. I know that one of the things that Jomo said was the fact that property rights have been prioritized over human rights. So today it's really just the law is about property rights, but I think we need to begin to rethink that. And the only way we can do that is if we are deliberate on a personal level, because the personal is political. Thank you.